The left has a problem. Now, I know that they have many problems, but this one is more pressing and ultimately more revealing than any other. It's been hiding in plain sight for decades, pushed out of the Overton window due to the influence of left-wing intellectuals pervading society and shaping our cultural zeitgeist. I wish there was a delicate way to do this, but it may just be best to rip off this plaster. The philosophical thought of the political left has, for years, been advocating for modes of thought and knowing, otherwise known as epistemologies, that excuse and at times actively encourage paedophilia. Now, when I talk about this, I'm not talking about your average centre-left liberal or social democrat. This derives from strains of radical far leftist thought that can be attributed to a series of intellectuals and philosophers. However, the ideas concocted by those in academia's ivory towers always find ways of disseminating into mainstream consciousness and corrupting whatever culture they find, and that's exactly what is currently happening. But before we get into the arguments that underpin the philosophical thought behind this, it may be best to go over a few examples of ideologically motivated paedophilia to illustrate that I am not simply pulling this out of nowhere. The problem with this is where to start. There's so many examples available to choose from, so I'll go over one that only recently came to light. Helmut Kendler, a German sexologist, was for decades placing homeless and neglected children, many of whom were already being taken advantage of on the streets as a way to survive, in the custody of paedophiles as foster parents. We already have a podcast on this, so go check that out for the full repugnant details. But just to cover the basics, Kendler was a sexologist, as I mentioned. Get used to hearing about these types and their vile attitudes and experiments later, who believed that one of the reasons that the Nazis had come into power was due to the sexual repression of the German people. Crazy, I know. One of the methods he saw for preventing that from happening ever again was through changing the sexual and cultural attitudes of Germany to be less repressive and more open. This was his way of shaping the attitudes of the next generation. Kendler himself was a homosexual who had been deeply repressed by his father as a child and had obvious issues to work through, evident not least because of the accusations that he himself was a child abuser. Shocking, I know, given his solutions for the problems that he saw. Nevertheless, this continued up until 2004 and was funded and supported by the German government. They thought that allowing children to be raised by paedophiles would prevent them from becoming Nazis. When the right-wing German AfD party brought all this information forward and tried to get the victims to come forward later in life to hold the government accountable, they were accused of taking advantage of the victims and agitating them to push their own political agenda. They were even compared with Nazis due to their position on the right wing and as conservatives. So even when an experiment conducted for an explicitly left-wing purpose puts children in the hands of nonces, the people fighting for justice on behalf of the victims are compared with Nazis. It just makes me angry thinking that this was permitted for so long. There's also the case of Marion Zimmer Bradley, a famous and influential feminist sci-fi author best known for her Avalon series, wherein she regales readers with Arthurian legends from the perspectives of the female characters. Alongside her literary work, she's also known for the prolonged sexual abuse of both of her children throughout their childhoods, while aiding and abetting her husband in abusing other children. After her husband's death in prison, convicted for the molestation of a 5-year-old, she began a relationship with her secretary, Elizabeth Waters, who continues to cover and make excuses for her crimes over 20 years after Bradley's death. Would you consider radical feminists to be on the cutting edge of right-wing thought? Well, maybe with all these TERFs running around nowadays, the mainstream would have you believe it, but traditionally, radical feminism has been a firmly left-wing movement. You can find a breakdown of the full list and timeline of Bradley's crimes on her official website, as well as excerpts from her depositions. But when Zimmer Bradley's own daughter, Moira Greyland, wrote an essay in 2015 explaining what happened to her, she blamed her mother's homosexuality, a very taboo thing to do in certain circles and not something that I necessarily agree with. However, it is true that a certain branch of gay culture does encourage an abolition of certain standards of behaviour and sexual norms, such as the consensual relations between adults and minors. We'll get more into that as we continue. Despite this controversy, she was nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Related Work. This was accomplished by Rabid Puppies, a group in conjunction with Sad Puppies, both right-wing conservative groups trying to propose slates for the Hugo Awards in an attempt to stem the tide of left-wing domination in the science fiction genre and awards ceremonies. They managed to secure all nominations for the entire category of Best Related Work. As a result of this association and the anti-homosexual sentiment expressed in the essay, the Hugo voters voted no award above all finalists, meaning no one in this category won. So, despite the fact that it was an essay by an actual victim of a hideous crime that affected her for the rest of her life, shedding light on her experiences of abuse, something the left wing supposedly cares about, the voters managed to get it blocked from winning any awards due to its anti-left wing sentiments. Truly the side of empathy and care. This is also a clear demonstration of the progressive stack. Victims of paedophilia do not reach as high as discriminated gays. So now we've shown some examples of what I'm talking about, it's time to take a look into what might have nurtured the societal atmosphere and attitudes that led to these people getting away with it. You might be familiar with the name Alfred Kinsey. Like Helmut Kentler, Kinsey was a sexologist. In fact, he was one of the leading sexologists behind the American sexual revolution. His book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, is considered the instigator for the movement and one of the foundational texts of sex education. In it, one of the subjects he covered in detail was that of child sexuality. You heard that right, child sexuality. To gain insight into this taboo subject, he interviewed a pedophile, who we now know to be a man named Rex King, who he protected by codenaming Mr. Green. King collected diaries detailing how he abused over 800 young boys and girls. In these diaries, he expressed his interpretation that a girl's tears were evidence of orgasm, and you've no idea how difficult that is to say out loud without getting angry. However, Kinsey considered all of this excellent research. Then there's another sexologist, Dr. John Money. It's been said that if any individual can be said to be responsible for modern gender ideology, it is John Money. He coined the terms gender role and gender identity. He coined the terms sexual orientation as a replacement for sexual preference. He also popularized the word paraphilia to replace the word perversions in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So if those crimes weren't enough, this is the man who coined most of the terms modern gender ideology now bases itself off of. As you well know, gender ideology is overwhelmingly supported and adopted by the left. But his true crimes are far, far worse than that. Some of you may be familiar with this case, but I'll go over it for those who aren't. After the botched circumcision of Bruce Raymer in the 1960s, Dr. John Money saw an opportunity to test one of his pet theories. He convinced Bruce's parents to allow a full gender reassignment on Bruce, renaming him Brenda, which was performed when Bruce was 2. For years afterwards, Money continued to see Bruce alongside his brother Brian to see how Bruce was developing now that he was a girl. As part of this process, he forced Brian and Brenda to simulate sexual acts with one another and took photos of their genitals. Supposedly, this kind of behaviour would encourage a healthy gender identity later in life. All of this was in pursuit of evidence for gender being a social construct, and Dr. Money believed that he had succeeded. After he found out what his parents had allowed to happen to him, Bruce detransitioned, renamed himself David, and wrote a book. Later on in the early 2000s, Brian killed himself, and shortly after, Bruce/David did too. Also of note was Money's belief that there was a difference between sadistic and affectional paedophilia, and that the latter was natural and an expression of surplus parental love. I wonder if he had a concealed reason for considering this so. Dr. John Money, when all of this eventually came out, blamed the media backlash to his sick experiments on the right wing and anti-feminist sentiment. So there's some of the foundational thinkers behind the sexual revolution that exploded in the 1960s. Let's examine some of the people involved in that period, specifically in France. Specifically, let's look at the legacy of Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and the writer Gabriel Matzneff. Things might start to get a little bit more heated here. So one of the most enduring, disgusting, and uniquely French attempts to excuse paedophilia has been the effort to try and characterise paedophiles as a persecuted underclass, an idea that has bled through into the works of noted queer theorists like Gail Rubin, who has been highly influenced by the likes of Michel Foucault. What differentiates this French movement is that in many of the previous examples brought up, the people behind them knew that they had to conceal what they were doing to the public or face widespread condemnation. The French did not. In a postmodern fashion, when examining concepts, the likes of Foucault, Derrida and Sartre all deconstructed concepts to their core, one of which was the age of consent, which France already treats rather like a suggestion rather than a rule, given that adults having sex with minors under the age of 15 is not automatically considered rape, unlike in an actual civilized country. In 1977, many of these French intellectuals signed a document trying to abolish the age of consent and make legal any consensual sexual act between an adult and anyone below the age of 15. Very progressive. Signatories include notable left-leaning Marx-influenced intellectuals such as Louis Althusser, Simone de Beauvoir, Michel Foucault, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Foucault in particular was highly concerned throughout his work with power dynamics. It's ironic that he would support this letter, which would make it incredibly easy for adults to exercise their power over children to abuse them. But then again, continental philosophy has never much been concerned with anything more concrete than pure abstraction. So unsurprisingly, Foucault has been hit with allegations of abusing children during his time in Tunisia in 1969. Jean-Paul Sartre's magazine that he co-founded, Liberation, consistently championed paedophiles as an oppressed minority, and he ran ads of adults looking for sex with children. There was even a writer involved in the movement called Gabriel Matzneff, who I've mentioned earlier, who wrote a book called Under 16 Years Old, which was about sleeping with children, you guessed it, under 16 years old. Are you starting to get my point now? These people are sleazy, disgusting monsters who damage the very fabric of our culture by disseminating their ideas through it. And unlike Foucault and Sartre, Matzneff is still alive. He won his most recent literary prize in 2015. He's now catching flack for abusing children, but he's in his 80s. For all intents and purposes, he's gotten away with it. More recently in this timeline, queer theorist Gayle Rubin defended paedophilia in her essay Thinking Sex: Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality, which was actually printed in the Lesbian and Gay Studies Reader in 1993, meaning in my eyes, that whole book and its editors are suspect. I'm quoting Rubin from her essay here. It is harder for most people to sympathise with actual boy lovers like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s. Boy lovers are so stigmatised that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone for their erotic orientation. Consequently, the police have feasted on them. Local police, the FBI, and watchdog postal inspectors have joined to build a huge apparatus whose sole aim is to wipe out the community of men who love underage youth. In 20 years or so, when some of the smoke has cleared, it will be easier to show that these men have been the victims of a savage and undeserved witch hunt. A lot of people will be embarrassed by their collaboration with this persecution, but it will be too late to do much good for those men who have spent their lives in prison. End quote. You can hear the similar, insufferable framing that the modern left uses when discussing progressive causes. The right side of history, for instance, is a phrase used to impose a feeling of moral inferiority on the people disagreeing with the person using it, and Gayle Rubin is using that same line of argument and that same rhetoric against those fighting child sexual abusers. Queer theory itself can be seen as a framework for society that implicitly and explicitly, at times, covers for and encourages paedophilia. It's a framework that advocates for the liberation of sexual identities and behaviours that are considered to be outside of the normative structures of society. Hence, paedophilia being something considered by many, sadly not everybody, but many, to be out of the norms of what society accepts, under queer theory frameworks they can be seen as a marginalised class and therefore worthy of defence. Combine this with the ideas of Alfred Kinsey and John Money of children being sexual beings who need to engage in sex to have a strong grip on their own identities, and you have a defence and an endorsement of paedophilia. This is just an extension of progressive leftist thought that aims to lift up anyone who could be seen as facing oppression by society. There's even a tweet I happened upon that sums up this attitude perfectly. Quoting here again, living fully into my queerness inside a partnership requires conditions where I/we can continuously defy existing boundaries guided by heterosexism, homophobia, misogyny, etc. Conditions that allow us to imagine and practice far more freeing, expansive, and radical ways to love. End quote. What kind of acts do you think constitutes a radical way to love? How far will they go in defying existing boundaries? Just a quick side note as well that this woman has her own book on furthering social justice causes called The Wake Up. Don't buy it. So these are the founders of the concepts and tools currently employed by modern gender ideology, and look at what those ideas have brought us. Countless examples of people using the ideology as a Trojan horse for paedophilic ideas and attempts to introduce children to ideas of sexuality at increasingly younger ages. Everybody remembers Cuties and the controversy surrounding that. It was a French film, unsurprisingly, that followed a group of young 12-year-old girls in a dancing crew as they prepared for a competition. It also followed their exploration of their sexual identities and featured scenes of them nude and in explicit situations. This was and still is widely available through Netflix, basically acting as easy access child porn for anybody looking at it. Mainstream critics lavished praise on this nonce bait. The backlash to this travesty was then afterwards labelled a right-wing campaign. There are other films available about adults in loving relationships with minors, like The Trouble with Being Born, where an android in the form of a young child has a relationship with her older daddy. Like Cuties, this was acted out with an actual minor. Popular leftist Twitch streamer Vorsh has made a number of arguments in favour of the ownership of child pornography and lowering the age of consent. He has since claimed that he no longer believes in these arguments, although nothing has changed in his core philosophy that would suggest a reason for this. There is also a worrying amount of people within the LGBT alphabet soup lobby who are beginning to advocate for MAP rights and identities, MAP meaning minor attracted person. I mean, there's a pro-pedo activist group called Prostasia that advocates for paedophilia being viewed as a sexuality, with non-binary university instructors advocating for them. These people always end up in university positions. They've been able to argue this because the left have given them the language they need to make an argument for it. And when you start to consider most characteristics as social constructions, how far do you go until you get to the age of consent being a social construction built to devalue and oppress younger people, just as Foucault and the other French philosophers concluded? This framework even works for other kinds of perverted behaviours. Vice and The Guardian have both in recent years published articles portraying incest between brother and sister in a sympathetic light. Then there's the horrifying story of Desmond is Amazing, a young boy convinced by his parents that he's gay and turned into a drag queen LGBT activist at the age of 11. He's been turned into a shining beacon, a mascot for LGBT rights by unprincipled lowlives before he even had the chance to make the decision himself. In the process of his so-called career, which I would call abuse, Desmond has been forced to dance suggestively in front of older men, accepting their money like a stripper, and brought into association with notorious drug addict and murderer Michael Allig. I could go on and on and on with this. None of this is to even go into the leftists covering for and excusing the behaviour of Islamic gangs raping children for the sake of preserving diversity. And there is an endless amount of evidence, and it all points to the same thing. The philosophy and beliefs of the modern left has previously, currently does, and will continue to excuse the behaviour of paedophiles, and increasingly attempts to normalise this kind of behaviour as natural. Are these the kinds of people you want influencing society? The kinds of people instructing your children and shaping their beliefs? The progressive train keeps running with no brakes and no end in sight. Give it enough time and this will become the next major activist cause. These ideas begin in the universities and are then unleashed into the real world where they have real consequences. The universities need to excise the rot within them that has allowed this festering pus to rise up into the mainstream consciousness or be reformed from the ground up. As I said at the beginning, the left has a problem. More accurately, the left has problems plural. But the long march that has allowed all of their other causes to gain mainstream acceptance needs to stop here. We need to protect our children.